Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the enigmatic founder of the Theosophical Society, understood something that modern humanity desperately tries to avoid. We are terrified of our own divine nature. In her groundbreaking work, The Secret Doctrine, she revealed that the greatest obstacle to spiritual evolution isn't external persecution or material hardship. It's the deep-seated fear we harbor toward our own soul's infinite potential. According to Blavatsky's teachings, derived from ancient wisdom traditions spanning Tibet, Egypt, and India, every human being carries within them a spark of the universal mind. This divine essence, which she called the higher self or Atman, represents our true nature beyond the temporary personality we identify with in daily life. Yet instead of embracing this magnificent inheritance, most people unconsciously recoil from it. This fear manifests in countless ways: the reluctance to spend time alone in silence, the compulsive need to fill every moment with external stimulation, and the desperate clinging to familiar but limiting beliefs about who we are. Blavatsky observed that when people catch glimpses of their soul's vastness through meditation, profound experiences in nature, or moments of deep introspection, they often retreat into the safety of mundane concerns. The root of this terror, she explained, lies in the ego's instinctive understanding that recognizing our divine nature would fundamentally transform everything we think we know about ourselves. The small, separate self that we've spent our entire lives constructing would be revealed as an illusion, a necessary but temporary vehicle for the soul's earthly journey. This isn't merely philosophical speculation. Blavatsky insisted that direct knowledge of our spiritual nature is not only possible but inevitable for those brave enough to face the unknown territories within their own consciousness. The question isn't whether we have a soul, but whether we have the courage to discover what that truly means. Blavatsky taught that the fundamental delusion plaguing humanity is the belief in separateness, the conviction that we exist as isolated individuals, disconnected from the cosmic whole. This maya, or illusion, creates a false sense of security by making the ego feel real and permanent. When we begin to glimpse the truth of our interconnectedness with all life, the ego perceives this as a threat to its very existence. In Isis Unveiled, Blavatsky described how this fear of unity manifests as an unconscious resistance to spiritual growth. People will sabotage their own meditation practices, avoid meaningful self-reflection, and surround themselves with distractions specifically to prevent the dissolution of their carefully constructed identity. The ego doesn't fear death as much as it fears recognizing its own illusory nature. This separative consciousness creates what Blavatsky called the dweller on the threshold, the accumulated fears, desires, and limiting beliefs that stand guard at the entrance to higher consciousness. This psychological barrier ensures we remain trapped in familiar patterns of thinking and being, even when those patterns cause suffering. The ancient mystery schools, which Blavatsky studied extensively, understood that crossing this threshold required tremendous courage. Students were warned that the journey towards self-knowledge would strip away every false identification until only truth remained. This process of spiritual purification isn't comfortable. It demands the death of everything we think we are. Yet Blavatsky emphasized that this fear is ultimately baseless. The soul cannot be diminished or destroyed by recognition of its true nature. What dies in the process of awakening is only the illusion of limitation. What emerges is the recognition of our eternal, infinite essence, the very thing we've been seeking through all our external pursuits. The irony, she noted, is that in fearing our divine nature, we deny ourselves the only thing that can provide lasting peace, joy, and fulfillment. We run from the very treasure we've been seeking our entire lives. According to Blavatsky's esoteric teachings, the human soul possesses capabilities that would seem miraculous to our ordinary consciousness. Drawing from Tibetan and Hindu traditions, she described latent psychic powers, siddhis, that naturally awaken as consciousness expands. Clairvoyance, telepathy, the ability to influence matter through focused intention and direct perception of past and future events. But it's not these supernatural abilities that truly frighten the ego. It's the recognition of the soul's creative power over reality itself. Blavatsky taught that consciousness is the fundamental force in the universe, and that our thoughts and beliefs literally shape our experience. This knowledge comes with overwhelming responsibility that the small self feels incapable of handling. When people begin to understand that they are co-creators of their reality rather than victims of circumstance, it shatters the comfortable narrative of powerlessness that has allowed them to avoid taking full responsibility for their lives. The ego prefers to blame external conditions, other people, or fate for its suffering, rather than acknowledge its role in creating those very conditions. Blavatsky observed that this fear of personal power manifests as a preference for being told what to think rather than discovering truth independently. People would rather follow religious dogma, scientific materialism, or popular opinion than trust their own inner knowing. The prospect of spiritual autonomy, of becoming a law unto oneself, is terrifying to minds conditioned to seek external authority. In her correspondences with early theosophical students, she repeatedly emphasized that the goal isn't to gain powers over others, but to recognize the power we already possess over our own consciousness. This includes the ability to transcend suffering, to create joy regardless of circumstances, and to maintain inner peace even amid external chaos. This level of self-mastery represents a kind of spiritual sovereignty that most people unconsciously fear because it would require them to grow beyond their current limitations and step into their full potential as divine beings. Blavatsky's synthesis of Eastern and Western esoteric traditions revealed a consistent warning across cultures. The path to self-knowledge requires confronting everything we've used to avoid knowing ourselves. The ancient Egyptian mysteries spoke of passing through the dark night of the soul, while Hindu scriptures described the terrifying encounter with Kali, the goddess who destroys illusion. These traditions understood that spiritual awakening isn't a gentle, peaceful process. It's a revolutionary transformation that dismantles every false foundation we've built our lives upon. Blavatsky taught that this is why most people unconsciously choose spiritual sleep over awakening, preferring the familiar suffering of limitation to the unknown territory of their true nature. The fear becomes particularly intense when seekers realize that knowing their soul means accepting responsibility for every aspect of their experience. There's no one else to blame, no external savior to wait for, and no escape from the consequences of their choices. This level of personal accountability feels overwhelming to minds conditioned to see themselves as small and powerless. Blavatsky also warned that approaching the threshold of higher consciousness can trigger what she called the guardian of the threshold, an intensification of all our fears, doubts, and negative patterns. This psychological backlash serves as a final test, ensuring that only those truly committed to truth will proceed further. Many spiritual seekers, she observed, reach this point and retreat back into conventional life, convinced that the spiritual path is too difficult or dangerous. They create elaborate justifications for abandoning their search, often becoming the most vocal critics of the very teachings that brought them to the edge of transformation. This retreat isn't failure. It's a natural part of the process. Blavatsky taught that the soul's journey towards self-recognition occurs across multiple lifetimes, and each apparent setback actually serves the greater purpose of eventual awakening. In her detailed analysis of human psychology, Blavatsky identified the sophisticated ways the ego protects itself from soul recognition. The most common strategy is what she called spiritual materialism, using spiritual concepts and practices to strengthen rather than dissolve the sense of separate self. People become proud of their meditation practice, competitive about their spiritual insights, or attached to being seen as evolved or enlightened. They collect spiritual experiences like trophies, using them to enhance rather than transcend their ego identity. This creates the illusion of spiritual progress while actually reinforcing the very barriers that prevent genuine awakening. Another defense mechanism is intellectualization, turning spiritual truth into philosophical concepts that can be studied and debated without being lived. Blavatsky observed that many students of theosophy became so fascinated with the complexity of her teachings that they used this mental engagement to avoid the simple but challenging work of inner transformation. The ego also employs doubt as a weapon against spiritual recognition. When people begin to experience their divine nature directly, the mind immediately provides rational explanations, dismisses these experiences as imagination, or finds scientific theories to explain away anything that threatens the materialistic worldview. Perhaps most cunningly, the ego uses fear of spiritual pride to prevent spiritual growth altogether. People convince themselves that recognizing their divine nature would make them arrogant or superior to others, so they maintain false humility that's actually a form of spiritual cowardice. Blavatsky taught that these defense mechanisms are not enemies to be fought, but patterns to be understood with compassion. They arise from the ego's sincere but misguided attempt to protect what it believes to be the self. The key is gentle but persistent inquiry that gradually reveals these patterns without triggering additional resistance. Blavatsky understood that recognizing our soul nature isn't just a pleasant revelation. It's a complete metamorphosis that changes everything about how we experience reality. This transformation is so profound that it literally feels like dying to the personality that has defined our entire existence. When people catch glimpses of their infinite nature, they often experience what mystics call ego death, a temporary dissolution of the familiar sense of self. While this is actually a profound gift, it initially feels terrifying because the mind cannot comprehend existence beyond its current boundaries. The ego interprets any expansion of identity as annihilation. This fear is compounded by the recognition that awakening to our divine nature would make our current problems and concerns seem trivial. People unconsciously worry that if they transcend their current level of consciousness, they'll lose the ability to relate to others or find meaning in ordinary human experiences. Blavatsky addressed this concern directly, explaining that true spiritual development doesn't remove us from human life, but allows us to engage with it more fully and compassionately. The awakened person doesn't become cold or detached, but rather loves more deeply because they see the divine nature in everyone. However, she acknowledged that the transition period can be disorienting. As consciousness expands, old patterns of thinking and feeling no longer work, but new patterns haven't yet stabilized. This liminal space between the familiar and the unknown can trigger intense anxiety and resistance. The transformation also brings up fears about how others will respond to our changes. People worry that spiritual growth will isolate them from family and friends who don't understand their journey. This social fear often prevents people from pursuing their spiritual development, choosing the security of belonging over the authenticity of self-discovery. One of Blavatsky's most challenging teachings concerns the level of responsibility that comes with soul recognition. When we understand ourselves as divine beings, we can no longer claim ignorance about our creative power or blame external circumstances for our suffering. This realization can feel overwhelming to minds conditioned to see themselves as victims of fate. Blavatsky taught that every thought, emotion, and action sends ripples through the universal field of consciousness, affecting not only our own future, but the collective human experience. This interconnectedness means that our spiritual development or stagnation impacts everyone we encounter and the world at large. This expanded sense of responsibility extends beyond our current lifetime. According to the doctrine of reincarnation that Blavatsky helped introduce to the West, our soul's choices create karma that influences multiple incarnations. Understanding this can initially feel crushing. The weight of endless accountability across lifetimes seems impossible to bear. The fear intensifies when people realize that awakening to their divine nature means they can no longer participate unconsciously in systems and behaviors that cause harm. They begin to see how their consumer choices, political affiliations, and daily habits contribute to suffering, and feel called to live with a level of integrity that seems impossibly demanding. Blavatsky also taught that advanced souls often incarnate specifically to serve humanity's evolution, taking on additional challenges to help others awaken. This concept of voluntary suffering for the greater good can terrify people who prefer to focus solely on their personal happiness and comfort. However, she emphasized that this responsibility isn't a burden, but a privilege. The soul doesn't experience the weight of cosmic responsibility as overwhelming because it understands its infinite capacity to serve. Only the limited ego, trying to shoulder infinite responsibility with finite resources, experiences this as terrifying. Blavatsky spoke openly about one of the most difficult aspects of spiritual awakening, the sense of isolation that comes with seeing reality differently than most people around you. As consciousness expands and we begin to perceive the illusory nature of the concerns that dominate ordinary life, we can feel profoundly alone in our understanding. This spiritual loneliness isn't mere social isolation, it's the recognition that we can no longer fully participate in the collective denial that most people use to avoid confronting deeper truths about existence. Conversations about material achievements, social status, and future security begin to feel hollow when viewed from the perspective of eternal consciousness. The fear of this isolation often prevents people from pursuing spiritual development. They unconsciously sense that awakening will separate them from the comfortable belonging they experience through shared illusions. Many choose to remain spiritually asleep rather than risk losing their sense of connection with others. Blavatsky experienced this loneliness firsthand during her years as a spiritual teacher. She was misunderstood, ridiculed, and attacked by both religious authorities and scientific materialists. Her advanced understanding made her a bridge between worlds that few could comprehend, leaving her isolated even among her own students. However, she taught that this apparent loneliness is temporary and ultimately illusory. As we recognize our divine nature, we discover a deeper connection with all life that transcends the superficial bonds created by shared beliefs and circumstances. We begin to see the divine spark in everyone, even those who seem most lost in illusion. The soul's loneliness is also alleviated by connection with others who have walked the same path. Blavatsky emphasized the importance of spiritual community, not for validation or comfort, but for mutual support in the challenging work of transformation. These connections, based on shared commitment to truth rather than shared opinions, provide sustenance for the journey within. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of soul recognition is understanding that everything we've identified as self must eventually be recognized as temporary costume rather than true identity. Blavatsky taught that we are not our personality, our thoughts, our emotions, our history, or even our spiritual achievements. We are the eternal consciousness that observes all these phenomena. This realization requires what she called the great dying, the voluntary release of every false identification that has given us a sense of self. Our carefully constructed personality, with all its preferences, opinions, and characteristics, must be seen as a temporary vehicle rather than our essential nature. The ego experiences this recognition as literal death because, from its perspective, it is. Everything the ego considers me and mine is revealed to be a cosmic play of consciousness rather than solid reality. This can trigger intense panic as the mind grapples with the possibility of existence beyond its familiar boundaries. Blavatsky emphasized that this death is not a loss, but a liberation. What dies is only the limitation, not the life. What emerges is the recognition of our infinite eternal nature, the very thing we've been seeking through all our attachments and achievements. However, she acknowledged that approaching this threshold can feel like standing at the edge of an abyss. The familiar structures of identity that have provided security and meaning appear to dissolve, leaving only the unknown vastness of our true nature. This is why many spiritual seekers retreat when they approach this final surrender. They would rather cling to a known but limited identity than release into the unknown infinity of their soul. Blavatsky taught that this retreat is not failure, but part of the natural rhythm of spiritual development. The courage to die to false self-identity while still living in a physical body represents the ultimate spiritual achievement, what various traditions call enlightenment, self-realization, or cosmic consciousness. In her final teachings, Blavatsky emphasized that overcoming the fear of our soul nature requires a specific kind of courage, not the heroism that faces external dangers, but the bravery to question everything we think we know about ourselves and reality. This spiritual courage develops gradually through consistent practice of self-inquiry and meditation. The first step is cultivating what she called fearless investigation, the willingness to examine our beliefs, assumptions, and identities without defending them. This requires developing comfort with uncertainty and learning to rest in not knowing rather than rushing to conclusions that maintain our familiar worldview. Blavatsky also taught practical methods for building courage to face our divine nature. Regular meditation allows us to gradually expand our comfort zone with consciousness beyond ordinary thinking. Study of wisdom teachings helps normalize the concepts that initially seem threatening to the ego. Association with others on the spiritual path provides support for the journey. Perhaps most importantly, she emphasized that recognizing our divine nature is not about becoming something we're not. It's about remembering what we've always been. The soul we fear is already present, already perfect, already free. Our spiritual work is simply removing the obstacles to recognizing what is already true. This perspective transforms the spiritual path from a difficult struggle to become divine into a joyful process of discovering our inherent divinity. The fear dissolves when we understand that we're not trying to achieve something foreign to our nature, but simply removing the veils that obscure our eternal essence. Blavatsky's final message was one of profound hope. Every human being, regardless of their current level of consciousness, carries within them the seed of cosmic awareness. The fear of our soul nature is ultimately a temporary phase in the inevitable journey towards self-recognition. The question isn't whether we'll eventually awaken to our divine nature. According to the cosmic plan she described, this awakening is guaranteed across the vast cycles of evolution. The only question is whether we'll choose to embrace this process consciously and courageously, or continue to resist it out of fear until circumstances eventually compel us to grow beyond our self-imposed limitations.